Joanna Bryant stood frozen in the center of Crosswell Group's marble lobby while her boss destroyed her life in front of 200 employees. "You were never management material," Damian Cross said loudly, tossing a termination folder onto the reception desk. "You confused being useful with being important." A few people looked away. Others pretended to check their phones. But the worst part wasn't the humiliation. It was seeing her husband standing near the glass elevators in his expensive navy suit, silently watching it happen. Spencer didn't defend her, didn't move, didn't even look ashamed. And when security reached for Joanna's office badge, she realized something far more terrifying than losing her job. This had been planned. If you've ever been betrayed by someone who benefited from your kindness, stay with this story until the end. Because Joanna Bryant was about to learn that some women don't break after humiliation. They become dangerous. Joanna Bryant woke up every morning at 5:12 a.m. without needing an alarm. Not because she was disciplined, because anxiety had trained her body better than any clock ever could. The house in Naperville was still dark when she slipped quietly out of bed, careful not to wake Spencer. The hardwood floors felt cold beneath her feet as she moved through the expensive kitchen she had once been proud of. Now it just felt staged, like a showroom for a marriage nobody was actually living in. She started the coffee machine first. Always first. Spencer liked his coffee exactly 7 minutes after waking up. 2 sugars, cinnamon powder, no foam. Joanna remembered every detail of his life, the way some people remembered birthdays or song lyrics. And Spencer remembered almost nothing about hers. By 5:40, she was packing his lunch while scanning emails on her phone from Crosswell Group. 3 marked urgent, 2 from Damian Cross himself. One message read, "Need revised projections before 8. Don't disappoint me again." Joanna swallowed hard. It wasn't even 6 in the morning. Behind her, Spencer finally walked into the kitchen wearing gray sweatpants and the expression of a man permanently irritated by existence. He didn't kiss her, didn't say good morning. He grabbed the coffee mug from her hand after one sip and frowned. "Too much cinnamon." Joanna blinked. "I used the same amount I always do." "Well, something tastes off." He walked away. No thank you. No smile. Nothing. Joanna stared at the empty space he left behind and suddenly felt exhausted in a way sleep could never fix. But she still packed his lunch, because that was who she had become. A woman who translated love into service until nobody remembered she was human anymore. An hour later, Joanna stood inside the shining steel elevator of Crosswell Group, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her cream blouse. Downtown Chicago glittered outside the glass tower windows, cold and expensive. Everything about Crosswell screamed power. The marble floors, the silent assistants in designer heels, the men in navy suits who talked like every sentence was a negotiation. And somewhere in the middle of all that was Joanna Bryant, the woman everyone depended on, and nobody respected. By 9 o'clock, she had already fixed a scheduling disaster, calmed an angry investor, rewritten part of Damian's presentation, covered for 2 executives running late, and ordered lunch for a board meeting she wasn't even invited to attend. "Joanna, can you print these?" "Joanna, where's the Henderson file?" "Joanna, Damian wants sparkling water." "Joanna, fix this." "Joanna, handle it." She handled everything. That was the problem. People stopped seeing capable women once they became too reliable. Around noon, Ethan Cole stopped by her desk, holding a stack of folders. "You know this place would collapse in under 48 hours without you, right?" Joanna laughed softly. "That's dramatic." "I'm serious." He lowered his voice. "Damian's presentation this morning. Half of it was your work." Joanna shrugged automatically. "It's my job." "No," Ethan said carefully. "Your job is assistant. What you actually do is run this company while men take credit for it." Before Joanna could answer, Damian's office doors swung open. The entire floor changed energy instantly. Damian Cross walked like a man who enjoyed making people nervous. Tall, silver-haired, tailored charcoal suit, controlled smile. He glanced at Joanna without warmth. Conference room. Now. Joanna grabbed her tablet immediately. Inside the room, Damian tossed a folder onto the table. These numbers are wrong. Joanna scanned the pages quickly. They were changed after I finalized them. Damian leaned back slowly. Are you making excuses? No, sir. I'm explaining what happened, same thing. The humiliation wasn't loud anymore. That was the terrifying part. Damian didn't need to yell to make people feel small. He simply looked at them like they were temporary, disposable. Joanna felt her chest tighten. I'll correct it immediately. You'll stay until it's perfect, Damian replied. I'm getting tired of cleaning up everyone else's incompetence. Everyone else's. Even though Joanna had practically built the presentation herself. When she finally left work that night, the city was drowned in freezing rain. Her shoulders ached. Her eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets for 12 hours straight. But the moment she stepped inside the house, Spencer barely looked up from his phone. You're late. Joanna placed her bag down carefully. I texted you. Damian changed the reports again. Spencer sighed dramatically. You let that job consume your entire personality. The words landed harder than she expected. Joanna stared at him. That job pays half our bills. That's not the point. Spencer tossed his phone onto the couch and stood. You're always stressed. Always tired. Honestly, you haven't been fun in years. Fun. As if adulthood was a performance she was failing. Joanna crossed her arms tightly around herself. I'm trying, Spencer. Well, try harder. Then he walked upstairs. Just like that. No discussion. No concern. No apology. Joanna stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the sound of his footsteps disappear. A memory flashed suddenly in her mind. 3 years earlier, she had been accepted into an MBA program at Northwestern. She remembered holding the letter with shaking hands, excitement pouring out of her chest. Spencer had smiled at first. Then he'd said, "One ambitious person in the marriage is enough." At the time, he kissed her forehead afterward and convinced her it made financial sense to wait. Wait until his career stabilized. Wait until they bought the house. Wait until things calmed down. Things never calmed down. Joanna slowly realized something terrifying. Her dreams had not died dramatically. They had died quietly, one compromise at a time. That night, Spencer fell asleep quickly beside her. Joanna couldn't. Moonlight spilled faintly across the bedroom ceiling while Spencer's phone buzzed softly against the nightstand. Once. Then again. Joanna hesitated, her stomach tightened instinctively. She reached for the phone before she could talk herself out of it. The screen lit up against the darkness. A message preview appeared. Vanessa Holloway. Joanna recognized the name instantly. Finance director at Crosswell Group. Beautiful, sharp, the kind of woman who walked into rooms and made people sit straighter. The text read, "Dinner after your wife falls asleep." Joanna stopped breathing. For a second, the world became completely silent. No traffic outside, no heater humming, no sound except the violent pounding of her own heart. Beside her, Spencer slept peacefully, like a man with nothing to hide. Joanna stared at him in the darkness, and for the first time since marrying him, she felt afraid of the person lying next to her. Joanna barely slept after seeing the message from Vanessa Holloway. By morning, Spencer was already in the shower, humming softly like a man untouched by guilt. Joanna sat at the edge of the bed, staring at his phone on the nightstand. Part of her wanted to unlock it, to search for proof, to confirm the betrayal her body already knew was real. But another part of her was terrified. Because once suspicion became truth, nothing in her life would survive unchanged. Downstairs, she mechanically made breakfast while Spencer came into the kitchen, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive white dress shirt. He looked polished, successful, untouchable, the kind of man people admired at corporate charity galas. Not the kind of man who texted another woman while his wife slept beside him. "You're quiet today," Spencer said casually. Joanna forced herself to look normal. "Just tired." "You've been tired for years." The comment slipped out carelessly, cruelly, like he genuinely didn't realize how much of her exhaustion had come from carrying both their lives on her back. Joanna swallowed hard. "Your mother still expects us at dinner tonight." Spencer nodded while scrolling through emails. "Yeah, don't be late this time." This time. As if she were the difficult one. The drive to Linda Bryant's house felt longer than usual. Rain clouds hung low over the wealthy suburban streets, turning the massive homes into gray silhouettes behind bare winter trees. Joanna stared out the passenger window while Spencer drove with one hand, barely speaking. Every now and then, his phone lit up in the cup holder. Each vibration tightened something inside her chest. Linda Bryant opened the door before they even reached the porch. Finally, she sighed dramatically. "I was beginning to think Chicago traffic had swallowed you." Linda kissed Spencer immediately. She barely acknowledged Joanna. The house smelled like expensive candles and roasted garlic. Soft jazz played through hidden speakers while guests laughed somewhere deeper inside the enormous home. Everything about Linda's world felt curated. Perfect china, perfect wine glasses, perfect fake smiles. And Joanna suddenly realized she was tired of pretending she belonged there. Dinner began with the usual performance. Linda bragged about Spencer's career. Spencer pretended humility. Joanna smiled politely at moments that required smiling. Meanwhile, nobody asked her a single meaningful question. So Linda said eventually, sipping white wine. "Still helping with calendars and coffee over at Crosswell." Spencer chuckled under his breath before Joanna could answer. "It's more complicated than that, Mom." "Is it?" Linda asked lightly. "I just never understood why a woman like Joanna would want all that corporate stress." "You were always so sweet, so domestic." Domestic. The word felt like a cage disguised as a compliment. Joanna folded her napkin carefully in her lap. "I actually manage most of Damien's operations now." Linda smiled the way people smiled at children describing imaginary careers. "Well, as long as you're happy." Spencer raised his wine glass. "She loves feeling needed." The table laughed softly. Joanna tried to laugh too, but something sharp twisted inside her stomach. Because Spencer used to admire her ambition once, back when they first met. Before marriage turned her into unpaid emotional labor. Before he learned how convenient it was having a wife who constantly sacrificed herself. Then the front door opened again, and the entire atmosphere shifted. Damien Cross walked inside like he owned oxygen itself. Tall, elegant, cold. Beside him stood Vanessa Holloway in a black silk dress that looked poured onto her body. Beautiful people always made rooms quieter. Joanna hated that she noticed how Spencer immediately straightened in his chair when Vanessa entered. Damien smiled when he saw Joanna, not warmly, like a man amused by something fragile. "Well," he said smoothly, "my favorite employee." Joanna forced a smile. "Good evening, Damien." Vanessa hugged Linda first, then Spencer. Too comfortably, too naturally. Her manicured hand lingered on Spencer's shoulder 1 second too long. Joanna noticed. Of course she noticed. Women always noticed. The problem was that women were trained to ignore what hurt them. Dinner became unbearable almost immediately. Damien dominated every conversation, while Linda hung on to his every word. Spencer laughed harder at Damien's jokes than anyone else. And Vanessa? Vanessa watched Joanna constantly, like she was studying her, measuring her weakness. At one point, Vanessa tilted her head innocently. "Joanna, are you still having those migraines?" Joanna froze. A small silence fell over the table. "How did you know about that?" Joanna asked, carefully. Vanessa smiled into her wine glass. Oh, Spencer mentioned it at a work dinner once. Spencer wouldn't meet Joanna's eyes. Something cold spread slowly through her chest. Because migraines weren't casual conversation. Neither were marriage problems. Neither were private things whispered in bed beside someone you trusted. Yet somehow, Vanessa knew them. Every few minutes, Joanna caught tiny moments Spencer smiling at Vanessa across the table, Vanessa touching his arm, Damien exchanging knowing glances with Spencer. It felt less like dinner and more like watching a secret society she hadn't realized excluded her. Then Damien leaned back in his chair with lazy amusement. You know what I admire about Joanna? Nobody answered. Damien smirked. She's loyal. The word hit Joanna strangely. She works harder than anyone in the building. Never complains. Never pushes too hard. He lifted his wine glass toward her. Women like that are rare now. Linda laughed softly. Oh, Joanna's always been a people pleaser. Another laugh around the table. Joanna felt heat crawling up her neck. Not because they were insulting her, because they were reducing her, turning her kindness into weakness, turning her loyalty into entertainment. Spencer finally spoke. She doesn't know how to stop taking care of people. Vanessa smiled faintly. That can be dangerous. Joanna looked directly at her. For one suspended second, something passed between them. Not uncertainty, not suspicion, recognition. Vanessa knew. And worse, Vanessa knew Joanna was beginning to figure it out. The rest of dinner blurred together after that. By dessert, Joanna could barely taste anything. Her body sat at the table, but emotionally she already felt outside the marriage, outside the room, outside herself. At some point, Spencer stood to take a call. A few minutes later, Damien excused himself too. Joanna watched them disappear toward the hallway. Something inside her finally snapped. Not loudly, quietly, like a thread breaking under years of pressure. I'll be right back, she said softly. Nobody even noticed her leave. The hallway lights were dim. Voices echoed faintly from Linda's office near the back of the house. Joanna slowed as she approached. Then she heard Damien speaking. Low, controlled, dangerous. She's noticing things faster than I expected. Spencer answered quietly. She's emotional, not stupid. A pause. Then Damien said the sentence that made Joanna's blood run cold. Handle her before she becomes a problem. Silence. Joanna stopped breathing. On the other side of the door, Spencer gave a tired sigh. I know. That was the moment everything changed. Not when she saw the text. Not when Vanessa smiled across the table. Not even when Spencer betrayed her. No. The real death happened there, in that dark hallway. Because Joanna finally understood something devastating. The people she loved were not protecting her from pain. They were discussing how to control her. And suddenly, she no longer felt like a wife. She felt like collateral damage. Joanna didn't say a single word on the drive home from Linda's house. Neither did Spencer. Chicago's skyline shimmered faintly in the distance, while rain streaked across the windshield in blurred silver lines. The silence inside the car felt unnatural now. Heavy. Watchful. Spencer drove with one hand on the wheel, calm as ever. Like he hadn't just stood in another room discussing how to handle his wife. Joanna kept staring forward because she was afraid that if she looked at him too long, she would either scream or cry, and she refused to do either in front of him. Not anymore. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Spencer turned off the engine and sighed. You're acting weird tonight. The audacity of it nearly made her laugh. Weird, Joanna repeated quietly. Yes. He unbuckled his seatbelt. You barely spoke at dinner. Joanna looked at him for the first time since leaving Linda's house. You talked enough for both of us. Spencer frowned slightly. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. Everything. Joanna almost asked him directly. Are you sleeping with Vanessa? Did Damien help you cover it up? Were you both planning to get rid of me? But fear stopped her. Not fear of the truth. Fear that he would lie smoothly enough to make her question herself again. So instead, she forced a tired smile. I'm exhausted, Spencer. His expression softened instantly. Not with guilt, with relief. Relief that she wasn't confronting him. That job is destroying you, he said as they walked inside the house. Honestly, maybe leaving Crosswell wouldn't be the worst thing. Joanna's stomach tightened. There it was again. That strange push, like he was slowly preparing her to disappear from the company, from his life, from relevance itself. Later that night, Joanna stood alone in the bathroom, staring at herself in the mirror. She looked older than 34, not physically, emotionally. There was a kind of exhaustion that settled into women who spent years shrinking themselves to keep peace around unstable people. And suddenly, Joanna could see it in her own eyes. The next morning at Crosswell Group felt different. Not because the office had changed, because Joanna had. For years, she moved through the company assuming she was safe if she worked hard enough. Now, every interaction felt loaded, strategic, dangerous. Vanessa passed Joanna near the executive elevators around 10 in the morning. Black pencil skirt, perfect hair, cold perfume. Morning, Joanna, she said brightly. Joanna forced herself to smile. Morning. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. You look tired. The comment sounded innocent, but Joanna heard the hidden meaning beneath it. You know something now, don't you? Before Joanna could answer, Vanessa leaned closer. You should really take care of yourself. Stress ages women terribly. Then she walked away. Joanna stood frozen beside the elevators while humiliation crawled slowly up her spine. Not because Vanessa insulted her, because Vanessa pitied her. And pity from the woman sleeping with your husband felt worse than cruelty. By lunchtime, Damien had already excluded Joanna from 2 major meetings she normally coordinated herself. When she asked his assistant about it, the woman avoided eye contact. Damien said Vanessa would handle executive strategy moving forward. Executive strategy. That had practically been Joanna's job for 2 years. Without the title, without the salary, without the credit. Joanna sat slowly at her desk, pulse hammering in her throat. Something was happening behind the scenes, something bigger than an affair. A notification appeared suddenly on her computer screen. Unknown number. Check your personal email. Use private browser. Her breath caught instantly. Joanna glanced around the office before opening her Gmail cautiously. One new message. No subject line. Inside was a single sentence. You were never supposed to see the expense reports. Attached was a spreadsheet. Joanna frowned and downloaded it. Rows of numbers filled the screen. Corporate expenses, consulting payments, vendor accounts. At first glance, everything looked normal. Then Joanna noticed repeating transactions routed through shell companies. Large amounts. Very large amounts. Her heartbeat accelerated. A second email arrived immediately. Look at the authorization signatures. Joanna zoomed in slowly. Damien Cross, and underneath several approvals. Spencer Bryant. Joanna stared at the screen in disbelief. Why would Spencer authorize Crosswell financial transfers? He wasn't technically part of the executive board. Cold unease spread through her chest. Before she could think further, another figure appeared beside her desk. Ethan Cole. He looked nervous. Can we talk somewhere private? 10 minutes later, they sat inside a small coffee shop across the street from Crosswell. Ethan kept checking the windows before speaking. You got the files, didn't you? Joanna stiffened immediately. That was you. He nodded. You need to be careful. Joanna lowered her voice. What is this? Ethan rubbed his jaw anxiously. I asked questions about those expense accounts 3 months ago. He looked directly at her. That's why Damien fired me. Joanna's stomach dropped. He said you violated confidentiality. That's what he tells everyone. Ethan leaned closer. Joanna, there's money disappearing from Crosswell. A lot of it. She stared at him silently. And Spencer, she whispered. Ethan hesitated. That part I'm still figuring out. The words hit harder than she expected, because some broken part of Joanna still wanted Spencer to be innocent. Not faithful, not loving, just not criminal. Ethan studied her carefully. You didn't know about Vanessa either, did you? Joanna looked away instantly. That answer was enough. Ethan exhaled quietly. I'm sorry. And somehow, those two words almost broke her, because nobody had apologized to Joanna in a very long time. Not Spencer. Not Damien. Not anyone. People simply took from her until she collapsed and then blamed her for bleeding. Back at the office later that evening, Joanna stayed late, pretending to reorganize reports. In reality, she was watching, observing, listening. And around 8:15 p.m., she saw Spencer leave the building through the side entrance, alone. Joanna's pulse quickened. Without fully thinking, she grabbed her coat and followed him outside. Rain soaked the streets while headlights reflected across wet pavement like shattered glass. Spencer walked quickly toward a black town car waiting nearby. Joanna slipped into her own vehicle and stayed several cars behind. Her hands trembled against the steering wheel the entire drive. Please don't let this be real. Please. The car finally stopped outside an upscale rooftop bar overlooking the Chicago River. Joanna parked across the street beneath dim winter lights. She watched Spencer step out first. Then Vanessa appeared from the opposite sidewalk. Elegant black coat, red lipstick, confidence. Spencer smiled the moment he saw her, not politely, not professionally, intimately, like a man in love. Joanna felt her chest cave inward. Still part of her clung desperately to denial. Maybe this was business. Maybe. Then Vanessa reached him, and Spencer kissed her. Slowly, comfortably, like they had done it 100 times before. Joanna stopped breathing. The world outside the windshield blurred instantly, not from rain, from tears. Spencer touched Vanessa's waist the same way he used to touch Joanna years ago, before routine replaced affection, before she became invisible. Inside the car, Joanna covered her mouth with shaking fingers as silent sobs tore through her body. But beneath the heartbreak, something else was beginning to form. Something colder. Because for the first time in years, Joanna wasn't asking herself, how do I save this marriage? She was asking, how long have they all been lying to me? And somehow, that question was far more dangerous. Joanna didn't sleep at all after seeing Spencer kiss Vanessa. She sat in her car outside their house for nearly 40 minutes before finally going inside sometime after midnight. Spencer was already home. Of course he was. He had showered, changed clothes, erased evidence. He lay asleep in bed like a man with a clean conscience, while Joanna stood in the darkness staring at him. She noticed things now she had ignored for years. The emotional distance, the impatience, the carefully timed affection whenever he needed something, the way he only became kind when he feared losing control. How had she mistaken dependency for love? For so long, Joanna quietly changed into pajamas and climbed into bed beside him without touching him. For the first time in their marriage, she felt absolutely alone. Morning arrived brutally fast. Gray winter lights spilled through the kitchen windows while Joanna mechanically prepared coffee she no longer wanted to make. Spencer entered wearing another expensive suit. Perfect tie. Perfect smile. Perfect liar. You're up early, he said casually. Joanna almost laughed at the absurdity of that sentence. She had always been up early. He simply never noticed. I have a full day, she replied quietly. Spencer studied her face briefly. Something cautious flickered in his eyes. Everything okay? There it was. That performance of concern. Not because he cared, because he was checking whether she knew. Joanna looked directly at him. For one dangerous second, she considered exposing everything. I saw you. I know about Vanessa. I heard what Damien said. But another instinct stopped her. A colder instinct. Watch first. Understand first. So instead, she nodded once. I'm fine. Relief flashed across Spencer's face almost immediately. It was subtle, tiny, but Joanna caught it, and somehow that hurt more than the affair itself, because it meant he was afraid of consequences, not afraid of hurting her. By 8:30 a.m., Crosswell Group already felt strangely tense. People avoided eye contact when Joanna walked past. Conversations stopped too quickly. Even the receptionists looked nervous. Joanna's stomach tightened. Something was wrong. Very wrong. At 9:12, her office phone rang. Damien wants everyone in the lobby, the assistant said quickly before hanging up. Everyone. Joanna stood slowly from her desk. Her pulse began hammering immediately. The executive lobby downstairs was already crowded when she arrived. Employees gathered near the marble staircase, whispering quietly among themselves. Damien stood near the center in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. Vanessa stood beside him, holding a tablet. And then Joanna saw Spencer near the elevators, watching. Not surprised, prepared. Cold realization flooded her body instantly. This was about her. Damien glanced at his watch dramatically. Now that we're all here, the room fell silent. Joanna felt dozens of eyes shifting toward her. Damien's expression hardened. Crosswell Group values professionalism, discretion, and competence. Joanna's throat tightened. Unfortunately, Damien continued, certain individuals have failed to meet those standards. Vanessa handed him a folder. Damien opened it slowly. The performance had already begun. Sensitive financial reports were mishandled, he said sharply. Internal confidentiality was compromised. Murmurs spread quietly through the crowd. Joanna stared at him in disbelief. No. No way. Damien looked directly at her. Joanna Bryant, would you like to explain why incomplete financial documents were leaked externally? Her blood ran cold. This was the expense report. The files Ethan sent her. They were setting her up. Joanna forced herself to speak evenly. I didn't leak anything. Damien tilted his head with fake disappointment. That's your response. It's the truth. Vanessa sighed softly beside him like a woman saddened by betrayal. The acting was almost impressive. We trusted you, Joanna, Vanessa said quietly. Joanna looked at her in shock. Trusted. The woman sleeping with her husband was talking about trust. A sharp laugh nearly escaped Joanna's throat, but the humiliation crashed over her too fast. Because people were staring now, whispering, judging. Joanna turned instinctively toward Spencer. Please say something. Please. Spencer held her gaze for only a second before looking away. And in that moment, Joanna understood everything. He wasn't trapped in this situation. He helped create it. Damien closed the folder decisively. Crosswell Group cannot tolerate incompetence at this level. Incompetence. The word hit Joanna like a slap. After years of sacrificing herself for this company, after carrying executives who barely knew how to organize their own schedules, after giving up pieces of her life to keep Crosswell functioning, this was how they erased her. With one word. In light of the evidence, Damien announced loudly, "Your employment is terminated effective immediately." The lobby became completely silent. Joanna felt heat rushing into her face. Her vision blurred slightly, not from weakness, from shock so severe her body couldn't process it fast enough. "You're firing me publicly," she whispered. Damien's expression didn't change. "You should have considered the consequences before violating company policy." Joanna stared at him, then at Vanessa. then finally at Spencer, and suddenly something terrifying settled inside her. Stillness, the kind that appears right before someone emotionally breaks. "You knew," she said softly to Spencer. He looked uncomfortable immediately. "Joanna, you knew this was happening." People nearby shifted awkwardly. Spencer lowered his voice. "Don't do this here." There it was again, protecting appearances, always appearances. Not her dignity, not her pain, the image. Joanna felt years of buried hurt rising violently toward the surface. "You let them humiliate me." Spencer sighed quietly like she was being unreasonable. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The sentence sliced through her chest. Not because it was cruel, because it was calm, calculated, as if her devastation was merely inconvenient. Damien gestured toward security. "Escort Ms. Bryant upstairs for her belongings." Two security guards approached awkwardly. One of them looked genuinely embarrassed. Joanna almost pitied him, because at least he still possessed enough humanity to feel uncomfortable. The elevator ride upstairs felt unreal. Nobody spoke. When Joanna reached her desk, employees pretended to work while secretly watching her pack. The same people who had relied on her every single day now couldn't even look her in the eye. Joanna placed framed photos into a cardboard box carefully. A coffee mug Spencer bought her 3 Christmases ago, a notebook filled with meeting schedules, a tiny, succulent plant already beginning to die from lack of sunlight. Her entire professional life reduced to one box. Then she noticed Ethan standing near the hallway. Fury burned across his face. "This is insane," he muttered. Joanna shook her head subtly. Not now. Because suddenly, she understood something crucial. Damien wanted her emotional. Broken women were easier to dismiss. So Joanna straightened slowly, lifted the box into her arms, and walked through the office with her head high, despite the humiliation crushing her lungs. When the elevator doors finally opened downstairs, the lobby had mostly cleared, except for one woman. An older, elegant woman stood near the marble columns wearing a camel-colored coat and leather gloves. Silver hair, sharp eyes, powerful posture. She watched Joanna carefully as security escorted her forward. Then just before Joanna reached the revolving doors, the woman spoke calmly. "You're not the problem." Joanna stopped. The woman's expression remained unreadable. "They're afraid of what you notice." A strange chill moved down Joanna's spine. Before she could respond, the woman handed her a business card. "Margaret Hale, Hale Capital Partners." Then she walked away without another word. Outside, snow had begun falling lightly across downtown Chicago. Joanna stood frozen beneath the gray sky, clutching the cardboard box against her chest. Behind the glass walls of Crosswell Group, she could still see Damien speaking confidently to executives, Vanessa beside him, Spencer nearby. All three continuing their lives like destroying hers meant nothing. And for one shattered moment, Joanna truly believed they had won. Joanna sat in her car for almost an hour after being fired. Snow gathered softly across the windshield while downtown Chicago moved around her in blurred gray motion. People crossed intersections carrying coffee cups and briefcases, rushing toward meetings and deadlines and lives that still made sense. Meanwhile, Joanna felt like someone had reached into the center of her existence and ripped everything apart at once. Her career, her marriage, her dignity, gone in a single morning. The cardboard box sat in the passenger seat beside her, like physical proof that a human life could be reduced to office supplies in under 15 minutes. Her phone buzzed. Spencer. Joanna stared at the screen until it stopped ringing. Then another message appeared. "Let's talk tonight when you calm down." When you calm down. As if she were the unstable one. Joanna laughed bitterly under her breath before tossing the phone onto the dashboard. A few seconds later, her eyes drifted toward the business card, still resting in her coat pocket. Margaret Hale. Hale Capital Partners. Joanna recognized the name immediately now that the shock had faded slightly. Margaret Hale wasn't just wealthy. She was legendary. A self-made investment strategist who built one of the most feared acquisition firms in Chicago before retiring nearly a decade earlier. Business magazines used to call her the woman CEOs prayed never noticed their debt. Joanna swallowed hard. Why would someone like that care about her? Still, she dialed the number. The assistant answered immediately. Ms. Hale has been expecting your call. That sentence alone sent a strange chill through Joanna's body. 2 hours later, Joanna stood outside a private members-only restaurant overlooking the Chicago River. The interior glowed with soft, amber lighting and impossible elegance. Quiet jazz floated through the air while wealthy executives spoke in low voices over expensive whiskey. Joanna suddenly felt painfully aware of her swollen eyes and emotional exhaustion. A hostess approached. Ms. Bryant, Ms. Hale is waiting for you. Margaret sat near the windows in a dark emerald suit with gold jewelry so understated it probably cost more than Joanna's car. She looked up calmly as Joanna approached. Sit. Not rude, not warm, simply commanding. Joanna sat carefully across from her. For several seconds, Margaret said nothing. She simply observed Joanna with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Finally, Margaret spoke. How long have you been apologizing for other people's cruelty? Joanna blinked. What? You apologize with your posture, Margaret said evenly, with your tone, with the way you make yourself smaller every time someone disrespects you. Joanna stared down at the table. Nobody had ever spoken to her like this before. Not with pity, with precision. A waiter appeared silently. Margaret ordered tea for Joanna before she could object. You knew what Damien was doing, Joanna asked quietly. Margaret leaned back slightly. I suspected. And Margaret's expression hardened almost invisibly. I suspected that too. The humiliation returned instantly, hot and suffocating. Joanna looked away toward the river. I feel stupid. Margaret shook her head once. No, you feel betrayed. Those are not the same thing. Something in Joanna's chest tightened painfully, because betrayal sounded softer than stupidity, more survivable somehow. Margaret folded her hands neatly on the table. I've watched Crosswell Group for years. Damien Cross built his company on intimidation and strategic dependency. She paused. Men like him survive by finding capable women willing to work beyond exhaustion for scraps of validation. Joanna swallowed hard. That's exactly what happened to me. Yes, Margaret replied calmly. And now they believe humiliation will keep you quiet. Joanna let out a weak laugh. I'm not exactly powerful enough to scare them. Margaret's eyes sharpened immediately. There's your problem. Silence settled between them. Then Margaret reached into her leather portfolio and slid several documents across the table. Joanna frowned and opened them carefully. Financial reports, debt summaries, internal holdings. Her pulse quickened immediately. Crosswell Group was drowning financially. Millions in leveraged debt, unstable acquisitions, hidden liabilities. What is this? Joanna whispered. The truth. Margaret took a sip of wine. Crosswell appears successful because Damien is excellent at managing appearances. But the company is bleeding money. Joanna flipped through pages faster now. Several shell corporations appeared repeatedly, including names she recognized from Ethan's files. Her stomach dropped. Oh my God. Yes. Joanna looked up sharply. He's stealing from the company. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Allegedly. But Spencer signed some of these authorizations. Margaret watched Joanna carefully before answering. That's because your husband isn't just sleeping with Vanessa Holloway. Joanna's throat tightened painfully. He's helping Damien manipulate the books. The words hit like ice water. For a moment, Joanna genuinely couldn't breathe. Spencer. Her Spencer. The man she defended for years. The man she cooked for, supported, protected. Wasn't merely unfaithful. He was involved. Deeply involved. Joanna covered her mouth with trembling fingers. "I don't understand," she whispered. Margaret's voice softened for the first time. "You understand more than you want to." Tears burned Joanna's eyes instantly. "I gave that man everything, and he got used to taking." The sentence shattered something inside her, because it was true, painfully true. Joanna thought about every compromise she'd made over the years, abandoning grad school, shrinking her ambitions, managing Spencer's emotions, cleaning up his mistakes, carrying responsibilities he never even noticed. Love had slowly turned into servitude, and she hadn't realized it until now. Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Tell me something honestly, Joanna." Joanna wiped at her eyes quickly. "What? If Spencer lost everything tomorrow?" Margaret paused carefully. Would he still know who he was? Joanna didn't answer immediately, because deep down, she already knew the truth. "No," she whispered. Margaret nodded once, and that terrifies men like him. The waiter returned with tea, but Joanna barely noticed. Her mind kept replaying everything: Spencer avoiding eye contact in the lobby, Vanessa smirking at dinner, Damien publicly humiliating her, the corporate fraud, the affair, the manipulation. Her entire marriage suddenly looked different in hindsight. Not romantic, strategic. Spencer loved being admired, loved feeling superior, and Joanna had spent years making him feel important while slowly disappearing herself. Margaret studied her silently. "You have two options now." Joanna looked up weakly. "You disappear quietly," Margaret said. "Get another assistant job. Let them destroy your confidence. Spend the next 10 years convincing yourself survival is enough." The words landed heavily, because that future sounded possible, terrifyingly possible. "Or," Joanna asked, softly. Margaret's eyes darkened. "Or you learn how power actually works." A strange silence filled the table. Outside, snow drifted across the river in soft, white spirals. Joanna felt something unfamiliar moving beneath the grief. Anger. Not explosive anger. Focused anger. The dangerous kind. Still, fear remained stronger. "I'm not like you," Joanna admitted quietly. Margaret almost smiled. "No woman starts that way." Joanna stared at the financial reports again. "I don't want revenge." Margaret leaned back calmly. "That's because you still think revenge means screaming." She paused. "Real revenge is rebuilding yourself so completely that the people who broke you become irrelevant." The sentence hit Joanna directly in the chest. For the first time, all day, something inside her shifted. Small, fragile, but alive. Margaret reached into her portfolio again and slid over another folder. Inside were books, courses, financial training schedules, corporate acquisition case studies. Joanna looked up in confusion. "What is this?" "Your education." Joanna blinked rapidly. "You're serious?" Margaret's expression became ice cold. "Damien Cross thinks humiliating you made you weak." She folded her gloves carefully. "I think it removed your distractions." Joanna stared at her speechless. Then Margaret stood, and before leaving, he said the sentence that would haunt Joanna for months afterward. "Kind women are dangerous once they stop apologizing." Then she walked away, leaving Joanna alone at the table, staring at the ruins of her old life and the terrifying possibility of becoming someone entirely new. Joanna sat in the driveway for nearly 10 minutes before going inside the house. The same house she once cried tears of happiness over when they bought it. The same kitchen where she learned Spencer liked cinnamon in his coffee. The same living room where she spent Christmas mornings pretending exhaustion was normal for married women. Now every room felt contaminated by lies. She stepped inside quietly. The house was dark except for the soft glow of the television in the living room. Spencer sat on the couch with his sleeves rolled up, one arm stretched lazily across the cushions like he owned peace itself. He looked up immediately when Joanna walked in. "There you are." His tone irritated her instantly. Not worried, not apologetic, just mildly inconvenienced. Joanna slowly placed her purse on the entry table. "We need to talk." Something shifted in Spencer's expression, a flicker of caution, but it disappeared quickly. About what? Joanna stared at him. For years she had practiced emotional restraint around this man. She softened her tone to avoid arguments, chose silence to avoid tension, swallowed hurt to preserve the relationship. "Not tonight." "I know about Vanessa." The room went completely still. Spencer didn't deny it immediately, and somehow that hurt worse than if he had. His jaw tightened slightly before he muted the television. "How long have you known?" Joanna almost laughed at the insanity of the question. "That's your response." Spencer stood slowly. "Joanna, I saw you." Her voice cracked violently through the room. Finally, finally some of the pain escaped. "I saw you kissing her." Spencer rubbed his forehead immediately like she was giving him a migraine. "Lower your voice." Joanna stared at him in disbelief. "You're worried about the neighbors hearing me. I'm worried about you being emotional instead of rational." There it was, that calm, manipulative tone he always used whenever she reacted to his cruelty. The tone designed to make her feel unstable for having feelings. Joanna folded her arms tightly around herself. "How long?" Spencer exhaled sharply. "A few months." The answer physically hurt, like something sharp sliding between her ribs. "A few months," Joanna repeated faintly. Spencer stepped closer carefully. "It wasn't supposed to happen." "Oh, well, that makes it better." "Don't do that." "Do what?" "This dramatic victim thing." Joanna blinked at him slowly. Victim thing. He cheated on her, helped destroy her career, humiliated her publicly, and somehow she was still the problem. Spencer began pacing, now frustrated. "You've been unhappy for years, Joanna. You think I was unhappy because I wanted another man," she snapped. "No." Spencer looked at her directly. "I think you stopped being yourself a long time ago." The words hit unexpectedly hard, because part of her feared he might be right. Not about the affair, about herself. Joanna had disappeared somewhere inside that marriage, but Spencer didn't get to use the damage he caused as justification for betraying her. "You made me disappear," she whispered. Spencer scoffed quietly. "That's unfair." "Unfair?" Joanna's voice shook violently now. "I gave up graduate school for you. That was your choice. I built my entire life around supporting you, and I appreciated that." The rage that exploded through Joanna's chest nearly made her dizzy. Appreciated, like she had been an intern, a service provider, not his wife. "You appreciated it," she repeated. Spencer's expression hardened. "Look, I'm not saying I handled things perfectly. You humiliated me in front of an entire company. That wasn't my decision. You knew about it." Silence. That silence answered everything. Joanna stared at him with tears burning her eyes. "You let Damien destroy me." Spencer looked away briefly. "It was complicated." "No," Joanna said softly. "You are?" For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rain tapped softly against the windows while years of resentment sat between them like broken glass. Finally, Spencer sighed. "You want the truth?" Joanna nodded once. Spencer's face became strangely cold. "You stopped being exciting years ago." The sentence landed with horrifying precision, not because Joanna believed it, because he meant it. "You became—" Spencer searched for the word carelessly. "Predictable." Joanna felt something inside her collapse. Not loudly, quietly, like the final support beam inside a burning building. I worked myself into exhaustion trying to support our life. And I never asked you to martyr yourself. Joanna laughed bitterly through tears. You benefited from it every single day. Spencer didn't answer, because he couldn't. The truth was sitting too openly between them now. Joanna suddenly saw her marriage with unbearable clarity. Spencer loved being admired, and being emotionally centered, yet having a wife who sacrificed without limits of being needed. But actual partnership, actual care. Respect. Those things had never mattered to him as much as comfort. And Vanessa? Vanessa made him feel powerful again, desired, interesting, while Joanna had become associated with responsibility, bills, stress, emotional labor. Spencer softened his tone slightly. I didn't mean to hurt you this badly. Joanna looked at him in disbelief. You think this is just about cheating. What else is it about? The question stunned her, because he genuinely didn't understand. It's about betrayal, Joanna whispered. You watched people destroy me and stood there like a stranger. Spencer crossed his arms. You're acting like Crosswell was some innocent environment. That company was eating you alive. You helped them fire me. His silence confirmed it again. Joanna closed her eyes briefly. Oh my God! Damien needed someone to blame for the audits, Spencer admitted carefully. If the investigation reached the executive accounts, you sacrificed me. It was temporary. Joanna opened her eyes slowly. Temporary. Her career, her reputation, her dignity. All temporary losses in Spencer's mind, because he assumed she would survive them quietly like she survived everything else. Something changed inside Joanna then. Not heartbreak. Heartbreak had already happened. This was clarity. Dangerous clarity. She walked calmly toward the kitchen counter where her wedding ring rested beside the sink from earlier that evening. Spencer watched her carefully now. Joanna. She picked up the ring slowly. The diamond caught the overhead light. For years, that ring represented loyalty to her. Commitment, safety. Now it looked like evidence. Joanna placed it gently on the marble countertop. Spencer's face shifted instantly. What are you doing? Joanna looked directly at him. For the first time in years, her voice sounded completely steady. You didn't lose your wife tonight. Spencer swallowed hard. You're overreacting. No. Joanna shook her head slowly. You lost the only person who ever loved you without conditions. The words hit him. She saw it happen. A flicker of panic crossed his face for the first time all night, because suddenly Spencer understood something terrifying. Joanna wasn't begging, wasn't negotiating, wasn't trying to save the marriage. And men like Spencer only felt fear when control disappeared. Where are you going? He asked quietly as Joanna grabbed her coat. She paused near the doorway, then looked back one final time. At the man she once built her entire future around. I honestly don't know, she admitted softly. But for the first time in years, I think I'm finally leaving the wrong place. Then Joanna walked out into the freezing Chicago night, leaving behind the marriage she spent years trying to survive. And inside the silent house behind her. Spencer finally realized his wife was no longer afraid of losing him. Joanna moved into a one-bedroom apartment 3 days later. Downtown Chicago looked different from the 20th floor window of her tiny rental unit. Not glamorous, not cinematic, lonely. The apartment smelled faintly like fresh paint and old radiator heat. Half her clothes were still folded inside cardboard boxes because she hadn't found the energy to unpack them yet. The silence there was brutal. No Spencer moving around upstairs. No coffee routine. No pretending everything was normal. At first, the loneliness nearly crushed her. Then slowly, it began to feel peaceful. On her second night alone, Joanna sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor, eating takeout noodles directly from the carton while staring at legal documents Margaret had sent over earlier that day. corporate acquisition structures, debt leverage models, hostile takeover case studies. Most of it looked like another language. Joanna rubbed exhausted eyes and muttered to herself, "What the hell am I doing?" Her phone buzzed immediately. "Margaret," Joanna answered cautiously. "How's your education going?" Joanna laughed tiredly. "I think I just read the same paragraph 6 times. Good. That's good. It means your brain is stretching." Joanna leaned back against the couch. "I don't belong in this world, Margaret." Margaret's voice remained calm. "Neither did I once." "Easy for you to say," Joanna almost replied. Margaret Hale walked into rooms and people listened. Joanna spent most of her life apologizing for existing too loudly. But every morning after that call, Joanna forced herself to continue. She studied before sunrise, studied at coffee shops, studied on the train, studied until her eyes blurred and her neck ached. For the first time in years, she was learning something for herself instead of someone else. And strangely, that terrified her. A week later, Margaret invited Joanna to Hale Capital's private office downtown. The place looked nothing like Crosswell Group. No flashy marble, no performative luxury, just sharp architecture, quiet confidence, and people who moved with terrifying efficiency. Margaret handed Joanna a thick financial report the moment she arrived. "Analyze this acquisition failure." Joanna stared at the 100-page file in horror. "You want me to read all this today?" Margaret didn't blink. "Yes. That's impossible." "No," Margaret replied calmly. "It's uncomfortable. Different thing." By hour 3, Joanna had a migraine. By hour 5, she wanted to cry. By hour 7, she realized something deeply humiliating. She had spent years managing executives more intelligent than her in finance because she never believed she could become one herself. Around sunset, Margaret finally sat across from her. "What did you notice?" Joanna hesitated. The debt ratio was hidden through layered vendor contracts. Margaret nodded once. "What else?" "The acquisition failed because leadership cared more about appearance than liquidity." Another nod. Joanna slowly frowned. "Wait." Margaret watched her silently. Joanna flipped through pages faster. This company wasn't collapsing accidentally. No. It was manipulated into dependency. Margaret leaned back slightly. "Now you're starting to see." A strange feeling spread through Joanna's chest. Not confidence, exactly. Awareness. For years, she believed power belonged naturally to certain people. Louder people, colder people, men like Damien, charming manipulators like Spencer. But now, she was beginning to understand something dangerous. Power wasn't personality. It was information, patience, leverage. Weeks passed. Joanna's life became brutally structured, mornings studying finance, afternoons with Margaret, evenings reviewing Crosswell documents, nights trying not to emotionally collapse. Some days, grief hit her so hard she couldn't breathe, like when she absent-mindedly reached for Spencer in bed, before remembering he no longer belonged there. Or when she saw couples laughing at restaurants and suddenly wondered if Spencer had ever truly loved her at all. But other days, anger carried her forward. Focused anger. One snowy evening, Ethan Cole met Joanna at a quiet bar near River North. He slid a flash drive across the table. "I finally got more internal records." Joanna stared at it cautiously. "How risky is this?" Ethan gave a humorless laugh. "Depends how much you enjoy lawsuits." Joanna smirked faintly for the first time in weeks. Progress. Back in her apartment later that night, Joanna plugged the drive into her laptop. Hundreds of files appeared. Expense reports, executive approvals, termination settlements. Joanna scanned document after document until one specific pattern emerged. Women. Almost every employee wrongfully terminated over the last 3 years had been female. and most had worked directly under Damien. Her stomach tightened. Joanna opened another file, then another. Performance complaints, confidentiality accusations, restructuring decisions, all strategically vague, all legally survivable, all devastating. A horrifying realization formed slowly. Damien wasn't just corrupt. He specifically targeted women who noticed too much, women who questioned numbers, women who became inconvenient. Joanna sat frozen in front of the glowing laptop screen, because suddenly her firing no longer felt personal. It felt procedural, like she had simply become the next problem to remove. Then she found Spencer's name again. Authorization records, consulting approvals, financial transfers linked to shell accounts. Joanna's pulse accelerated. One transaction in particular stood out. $480,000, authorized jointly by Damien Cross and Spencer Bryant. Her mouth went dry. "What the hell were you doing?" she whispered. The front desk intercom buzzed, suddenly startling her. Delivery for Joanna Bryant. Confused, Joanna opened the apartment door moments later. A massive bouquet of white roses sat outside. No card at first. Then she noticed the envelope hidden underneath. Inside was a handwritten note. "We both said things we didn't mean. Let's stop making this ugly." Joanna stared at the note for several seconds. Then she laughed. Actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. Spencer still thought this was salvageable. Still believed flowers could repair betrayal. Still believed Joanna's pain existed mainly as an obstacle to his comfort. Her phone rang immediately afterward. Spencer. Joanna considered ignoring it, then answered calmly. "What?" A pause. His voice softened instantly. "Joanna, I miss you." The manipulation was almost automatic now. Gentle tone, emotional vulnerability, carefully measured regret. Once upon a time, it would have worked. Not tonight. "You miss having access to me," Joanna replied coldly. Silence. Then Spencer sighed. "Can we not do this?" "No," Joanna said quietly. "We absolutely need to do this. Vanessa means nothing." The words barely affected her anymore. Not because the betrayal stopped hurting, because clarity had replaced illusion. "Then why risk your marriage for her?" Spencer hesitated too long. That was answer enough. Finally, he spoke again. "You changed." Joanna looked around her tiny apartment, stacks of finance books, highlighted contracts, legal notes covering the coffee table, evidence files, glowing on her laptop screen. "Yes," she said softly. "I did." Spencer's tone sharpened slightly. "This obsession with Damien and Crosswell isn't healthy." Joanna almost smiled. There it was again. Control disguised as concern. "You should let this go." Spencer continued carefully. "You're not built for this world." Joanna's eyes slowly drifted back toward the financial files, toward the evidence, toward the years of manipulation. Maybe he was right once. Maybe she wasn't built for that world before. But broken women rebuilt themselves every day. And sometimes they rebuilt sharper. "You know what's funny?" Joanna said quietly. "What?" "For years you convinced me I was weak because I was kind." Spencer stayed silent. Joanna's voice became calm as ice. "But now I think you were terrified of what would happen if I stopped being easy to control." For the first time during the conversation, Spencer had no response. Joanna ended the call without another word. Then she turned back toward the laptop screen, toward the evidence, toward the destruction waiting quietly beneath Crosswell Group. And somewhere deep inside herself, Joanna Bryant finally began understanding something terrifying. She no longer wanted survival. She wanted leverage. By the second month of working with Margaret Hale, Joanna Bryant stopped apologizing before speaking. Margaret noticed immediately. So she said one afternoon, while reviewing acquisition reports, the spine finally arrived. Joanna smirked faintly from across the conference table. I'm still terrified most of the time. Good, Margaret replied calmly. Fear keeps people observant. Ego makes them stupid. The conference room overlooked downtown Chicago through massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Snow drifted slowly between skyscrapers, while traders and executives moved through the city below like pieces on a giant financial chessboard. For the first time in her life, Joanna no longer felt invisible inside rooms like this, not fully powerful yet, but no longer small. That difference mattered. Her days became increasingly structured mornings, studying acquisition strategy, afternoons reviewing Crosswell debt structures, evenings meeting quietly with Rebecca Sloan, nights building something dangerous. Rebecca Sloan was unlike anyone Joanna had ever met. Corporate attorney, Harvard-educated, emotionally unreadable. She wore black tailored suits and spoke like every sentence could become evidence later. Their first meeting lasted exactly 12 minutes before Rebecca closed the file in front of her and looked directly at Joanna. You have enough documentation to ruin reputations, Rebecca said calmly, but not enough yet to control outcomes. Joanna leaned forward slightly. What's the difference? Rebecca's expression never changed. Amateurs expose scandals. Smart women own leverage. That sentence stayed with Joanna for weeks, because revenge used to mean emotional satisfaction to her. Now it meant positioning, timing, patience. Margaret often said, power isn't loud, it's prepared. And Joanna was learning, fast. One rainy Thursday evening, Ethan Cole arrived at Joanna's apartment, carrying another stack of internal Crosswell records. He looked exhausted. They're getting sloppy. Joanna took the files carefully. What happened? Damien's nervous. Ethan loosened his tie while pacing slowly through the apartment. Internal auditors started asking questions last week. Vanessa's been locking down executive access. Joanna's pulse quickened. Good. Pressure created mistakes. She spread the documents across the kitchen table while Ethan watched her work. Sometimes he still looked surprised seeing Joanna like this. Focused, sharp, dangerously calm. Not the exhausted assistant everyone ignored at Crosswell. A different woman was emerging now. Joanna scanned a vendor agreement carefully before freezing. Wait. Ethan stopped pacing. What Joanna pointed toward a transaction trail. This shell company. I've seen it before. She opened another file quickly, then another, and suddenly the pattern became obvious. Crosswell wasn't just hiding debt. Damien had been quietly selling unstable liabilities through secondary holding corporations for months. And Spencer approved several of the transfers. Joanna stared at the signatures with cold disbelief. Her husband had helped create financial fraud worth millions while still coming home every night asking what was for dinner. The duality of men truly terrified her now. How deep is Spencer involved? Ethan asked quietly. Joanna swallowed hard, deep enough to panic if this becomes public. For a moment, silence filled the apartment. Then Ethan looked at her carefully. You okay? The old Joanna might have answered automatically. I'm fine, but she was learning honesty too. No, she admitted softly, but I think I'm done confusing pain with weakness. Ethan nodded slowly. Good. Later that night, Joanna sat alone reviewing acquisition maps Margaret had prepared. Crosswell Group owed money in too many directions, which meant something very important: they were vulnerable. Margaret arrived shortly after 9, carrying coffee and another folder. Without greeting, she dropped the folder onto the table. Crosswell's secondary debt holders. Joanna opened it immediately. Dozens of entities. Several already unstable. Margaret removed her gloves carefully. Damien built his empire on aggressive expansion and intimidation. That works beautifully until cash flow tightens. Joanna studied the numbers intensely, then slowly looked up. You think the company can be acquired? Margaret's eyes sharpened slightly. I think desperate companies become predictable. Joanna's heartbeat accelerated. For the first time, the possibility became real. Not emotional revenge, actual power. Still, fear remained. I don't know how to do this. Margaret gave her a long look. Yes, you do. Joanna frowned. No, I really don't. Margaret leaned forward calmly. For years, you managed executives without authority. You learned how they think, what motivates them, what blinds them. She paused. You understand powerful men better than they understand themselves. The realization unsettled Joanna because it was true. Damien relied on intimidation. Spencer relied on emotional manipulation. Both believed Joanna existed beneath them, and arrogance always created openings. Margaret slid another document toward her, a shell acquisition structure. Joanna stared down at it. You want me to buy Crosswell debt? I want you to understand how quietly empires collapse. Joanna's pulse hammered harder now. This was no longer theoretical. They were building something real, dangerous. Weeks passed quickly after that. Joanna learned how corporations hid weakness, how negotiations worked, how debt could become ownership. And the more she learned, the less emotional she became about Spencer. That frightened her slightly, not because she missed him, because indifference felt colder than heartbreak. One evening, Spencer appeared unexpectedly outside her apartment building. Joanna saw him leaning against his black Mercedes through the lobby windows before she even stepped outside. Perfect coat, perfect haircut, perfect performance. He smiled faintly when he saw her. There's my wife. Joanna didn't smile back. I'm not your wife emotionally anymore. The comment visibly irritated him. Can we not do this in public? There it was again. Image management. Always image management. Spencer followed her toward the sidewalk. You've been avoiding me for weeks. I've been rebuilding my life. You're acting like I destroyed it. Joanna stopped walking slowly. The audacity almost impressed her now. You helped publicly humiliate me, she said evenly. You cheated on me. You participated in financial fraud. What exactly would qualify as destruction to you? Spencer glanced around uncomfortably. Lower your voice. Joanna laughed softly. Months ago, she would have obeyed instantly. Now she saw fear beneath his composure. Interesting. Spencer stepped closer. Vanessa means nothing. Then why are you still seeing her? He hesitated. Too long. Again. Joanna shook her head slowly. You know what's sad, Spencer? His jaw tightened. What? You still think this conversation is about love? For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. Joanna looked directly at him. It stopped being about love, the moment you treated my loyalty like something disposable. Spencer exhaled sharply. You've changed. Yes, and I don't like who you're becoming. The sentence almost made her smile. Because finally, Joanna understood the real reason Spencer was uncomfortable. Not because she was cruel, because she was no longer controllable. Her phone buzzed suddenly. Margaret. Joanna answered immediately. Yes. Margaret's voice remained calm. It's done. Joanna's pulse quickened. What is the debt transfer? Spencer frowned slightly. What debt transfer? Joanna looked at him silently for several seconds, then slowly smiled for the first time in months. Not warmly, dangerously. And somewhere across downtown Chicago, Damien Cross was unknowingly signing the agreement that would eventually destroy him. Because hidden beneath layers of shell entities and secondary holdings, Joanna Bryant had just quietly purchased a piece of Crosswell Group's debt. And powerful men rarely noticed danger until a woman they underestimated became impossible to control. 6 months after being escorted out of Crosswell Group with a cardboard box in her trembling hands. Joanna Bryant walked back into the building wearing a charcoal gray power suit worth more than 3 months of her old salary. And this time, nobody looked through her. The revolving glass doors spun slowly behind her as she entered the lobby. Winter sunlight reflected against polished marble floors, while executives moved through the building with their usual rushed arrogance. But one by one, people stopped walking, stopped talking, stopped breathing, because Joanna Bryant no longer looked like the exhausted assistant they remembered. She looked dangerous. Her dark hair fell in soft, controlled waves over the collar of her tailored coat. Her posture had changed most of all. Calm now, grounded, no more apologetic shrinking. The old Joanna entered rooms hoping not to inconvenience anyone. This Joanna entered rooms expecting space to be made for her. Even the receptionist nearly stood too quickly. Ms. Bryant? Joanna smiled politely. Good morning. The woman blinked rapidly. Word spread instantly through the lobby like electricity. Joanna Bryant is here. By the time she reached the executive elevators, 3 employees were openly whispering behind her. She looks incredible. I thought she moved away. Why is she here? Joanna heard all of it. But the most satisfying part, nobody sounded sorry for her anymore. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and standing inside was Spencer. Of course. For one suspended moment, neither of them moved. Spencer looked almost physically stunned. His eyes traveled slowly over Joanna's appearance, confusion, mixing with something sharper. Regret. Joanna stepped into the elevator calmly beside him. The doors closed. Silence wrapped tightly around them. Finally, Spencer spoke. You look different. Joanna pressed the button for the executive floor. So do you. It wasn't entirely a lie. Spencer looked worse. The stress showed now faint exhaustion beneath his eyes, tension in his jaw, the subtle unraveling of a man losing control over too many things at once. What are you doing here? He asked carefully. Joanna glanced at him. Working. Spencer frowned. At Crosswell, Joanna smiled faintly. You'll find out soon enough. The uncertainty in his expression deepened instantly. Good. For years, Joanna lived in confusion while Spencer controlled information around her like a weapon. Now it was his turn. When the elevator opened onto the executive floor, conversations died immediately. Every head turned. Assistants froze mid-step. Analysts stopped typing. Even Vanessa Holloway looked visibly shaken when she emerged from the conference hallway, carrying financial reports. For one beautiful second, Vanessa actually looked intimidated. Joanna almost enjoyed it too much. Vanessa said carefully. Still elegant, still polished, but no longer untouchable. Joanna's voice remained smooth. Vanessa. A tense silence settled between them. Vanessa recovered first. I didn't realize you'd be visiting. I'm not visiting. Before Vanessa could respond, Damien's office doors opened. Damien Cross stepped out mid-conversation with 2 board members before suddenly stopping cold. The entire floor seemed to hold its breath. Damien stared at Joanna like he'd seen a ghost. And for the first time since she met him, he looked uncertain. Well, he said slowly, this is unexpected. Joanna smiled calmly. I imagine today will be full of surprises. Damien studied her carefully now, calculating, trying to understand why she looked so calm, why she wasn't angry. Broken women were easier for men like Damien to manage. But Joanna no longer looked broken. That unsettled him immediately. One of the board members glanced awkwardly between them. Damien straightened slightly. If you're here regarding your termination, legal already handled your severance. Joanna almost laughed. He still thought she came back seeking closure. An apology. Compensation. Men like Damien always underestimated women once emotions stopped showing visibly. That won't be necessary, Joanna replied. Vanessa crossed her arms carefully. Then why exactly are you here? Before Joanna could answer, the elevator doors opened again, and Margaret Hale stepped out. The energy on the floor changed instantly. Even Damien visibly stiffened. Because unlike Joanna, Margaret Hale's reputation terrified powerful people openly. Behind her walked Rebecca Sloan, two corporate attorneys, several financial analysts carrying sealed document folders. Every executive nearby suddenly looked nervous. Margaret approached slowly, elegant, controlled, lethal. "Damien," she said smoothly, "you're late for the board meeting." Damien frowned. "What board meeting?" Margaret's eyebrow lifted slightly. "The emergency one." For the first time, real confusion crossed Damien's face. Joanna watched it happen carefully. The beginning of collapse always looked subtle at first. Rebecca Sloan began distributing sealed folders to board members waiting nearby. Vanessa stepped forward sharply. "What is this?" Rebecca answered, without emotion. "Updated ownership disclosures." Spencer had gone completely pale beside Joanna now. Good. He was finally starting to understand. Damien snatched one folder open aggressively. His expression changed after reading the first page. Then the second. Then the third. Joanna watched the exact moment the blood drained from his face. "No," Damien whispered. Margaret remained calm. "Yes." Damien looked up violently. "This is impossible." Rebecca adjusted her glasses. "Hale Capital Partners completed secondary debt acquisition restructuring 4 weeks ago." Vanessa grabbed another document. Her hands visibly trembled now. Spencer stared at Joanna in disbelief. "What did you do?" Joanna finally turned toward him fully, and suddenly every painful moment from 6 months earlier flashed through her mind standing humiliated in the lobby. Spencer refusing to defend her security, escorting her out. Damien calling her disposable. Vanessa smirking across dinner tables. All of it led here. Joanna's voice stayed perfectly calm. "I learned." Damien slammed the folder shut. "You think buying debt gives you authority here?" Margaret answered before Joanna could. "No." She smiled slightly. "Majority ownership does." The entire executive floor went silent. Absolute silence. Even the assistants nearby looked stunned. Damien stared at Joanna like his brain physically could not process what he was hearing. Because in his world, women like Joanna stayed broken. They disappeared quietly. They didn't come back stronger. They certainly didn't buy companies. Spencer stepped toward her carefully. "Joanna?" But she didn't even look at him. Not this time. For years, Spencer believed he was the center of every room Joanna entered. Now he wasn't even the center of her attention. Rebecca Sloan handed Damien another document. "Pending review of financial misconduct, executive authority is suspended effective immediately." Vanessa whispered softly. "Oh my God." Damien's composure finally cracked. "This is corporate sabotage." Margaret's expression sharpened instantly. "No, Damien." She glanced toward Joanna. "This is what happens when intelligent women stop underestimating themselves." The words echoed across the silent executive floor. Joanna slowly removed her coat, then handed it calmly to an assistant standing nearby in shock. And with terrifying composure, she walked directly toward the executive offices, toward the office Damien once used to destroy her, while everyone around her finally realized something irreversible. Joanna Bryant hadn't returned for revenge alone. She had returned for ownership. The executive floor had never been this quiet before, not during layoffs, not during audits, not even during market crashes, because fear moved differently when power changed hands unexpectedly. Joanna walked through the corridor with calm, measured steps, while employees watched from behind glass offices and partially opened doors. 6 months ago, those same hallways witnessed her humiliation. Today, they witnessed her return. Damien Cross followed several feet behind her, furious enough to shake. This is temporary, he snapped. You have no idea how this industry works. Joanna didn't slow down. No, she said calmly. I just learned faster than you expected. Margaret remained near the boardroom, speaking quietly with attorneys, while Rebecca Sloan coordinated documents with terrifying efficiency. Spencer stood motionless near the elevators, still stunned, still trying to understand how the woman he once dismissed had become the most dangerous person in the building. Joanna finally reached Damien's office. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Chicago in glittering winter light. The office was massive black marble desk, imported whiskey shelves, abstract art worth more than most employees' salaries, a view designed to make men feel powerful. Joanna remembered the first time she entered this office years ago. She had been nervous, intimidated, eager to impress. Now she only saw insecurity disguised as luxury. Damien moved ahead of her aggressively. You think buying debt makes you qualified to sit in my office? Joanna calmly placed her leather portfolio onto the desk. Actually, she replied softly, the board vote did that. Damien slammed a hand against the table. You manipulated this entire acquisition. Joanna looked directly at him. No, I understood it. The distinction mattered. Damien laughed bitterly. You were an assistant. The old insult. The old dismissal. Only this time, it no longer had power. Joanna slowly removed her gloves. Yes, she said quietly. And while men like you were busy talking over me, I learned everything. That answer visibly unsettled him, because Damien suddenly realized the same thing Spencer had realized too late. Women who are ignored often become experts unnoticed. A knock interrupted the tension. Rebecca entered holding another stack of files. We've completed preliminary review of executive authorizations. Damien crossed his arms, and Rebecca's expression remained perfectly neutral. And the fraud exposure is worse than expected. She handed Joanna several documents. Joanna reviewed them calmly while Damien watched with rising panic. Millions hidden through secondary vendors, manipulated reporting, unauthorized expense transfers. Crosswell wasn't unstable anymore. It was bleeding internally, and Damien knew it. Joanna looked up slowly. How long were you planning to continue? Damien scoffed. You think corporations survive without dirty accounting? Not like this. He stepped closer. You have no idea what pressure looks like. Joanna's jaw tightened slightly. Pressure. She thought about sacrificing her career, carrying emotional labor alone, being publicly humiliated, rebuilding herself from nothing, studying until 3 a.m., surviving betrayal from the people she trusted most. Men always underestimated female endurance because women suffered quietly. That didn't mean they suffered less. You're right, Joanna replied evenly. I don't know what pressure feels like from the top floor. She paused. I know what it feels like underneath people like you. Silence. Damien stared at her with open hatred now. Good. Hatred meant fear was growing underneath it. Another knock sounded. This time, Spencer entered carefully. His eyes immediately found Joanna and lingered. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he looked at her now. Not just regret, recognition, like he was finally seeing her clearly for the first time. We need to talk, Spencer said quietly. Joanna didn't even look up from the documents. No, Joanna. No, she repeated calmly. You lost the right to private conversations when you turned my humiliation into career strategy. The words hit harder than yelling ever could. Spencer visibly flinched. Damien rolled his eyes impatiently. This emotional drama is irrelevant compared to what's happening here. Joanna finally looked directly at him. No, Damien. It's exactly what's happening here. He frowned. You built this company by exploiting loyalty, Joanna continued. You found hardworking people and convinced them exhaustion was privilege. Her voice sharpened slightly. Especially women. The room fell silent again, because everyone knew she was right. Rebecca quietly closed the office doors behind them. Joanna stepped slowly around Damien's desk. The desk. The same desk he sat behind while firing employees without remorse. The same desk where he destroyed reputations calmly over expensive whiskey. The same desk he believed represented permanent power. Joanna placed one hand lightly against the black marble surface. Then she sat down in Damien's chair. The symbolism was almost too perfect. Damien looked genuinely furious now. "You arrogant little careful Rebecca," interrupted coldly. "You're no longer protected by executive immunity." Damien went silent immediately. Interesting. Bullies always remembered professionalism once consequences appeared. Joanna opened another folder calmly. "Internal investigations begin today." Spencer stepped forward sharply. "Joanna, don't do this." She looked at him slowly. "Why?" His throat tightened. "Because once this starts, people get destroyed." Joanna almost smiled. Destroyed. Now he cared about destruction. Not when it happened to her publicly in the lobby. Not when he let her career collapse. Not when he watched security escort her out like a criminal. Only now, when consequences threatened him. Joanna leaned back slightly in Damien's chair. "You know what's fascinating?" she asked quietly. "Men like both of you always mistake kindness for weakness." Neither man answered. Joanna's eyes moved calmly between them. "But kindness becomes very dangerous once it stops protecting you." The silence afterward felt razor sharp. Then Joanna pressed the intercom button on the desk. "Security." A voice answered instantly. "Yes, Ms. Bryant." The title hit the room hard. Ms. Bryant. Not assistant. Not employee. Authority. Joanna's gaze never left Damien's. "Mr. Cross has 15 minutes to remove personal belongings from this office." Damien's face darkened violently. "This is my company." "No," Joanna corrected softly. It was. Security arrived faster than expected. 2 guards entered carefully, the exact same kind of escort Joanna once received, only this time, she wasn't the one being removed. Damien looked humiliated beyond words. And for one brief second, Joanna remembered how cold that lobby felt 6 months ago. How helpless she'd been. How small. But strangely, watching Damien unravel didn't make her feel triumphant the way she expected. It made her feel awake. Like she finally understood something important about power. The people who humiliate others rarely imagine themselves vulnerable. Until suddenly, they are. Damien grabbed several files aggressively before storming toward the door. Just before leaving, he turned back toward Joanna. "This won't end the way you think." Joanna held his gaze calmly, then delivered the sentence she imagined during countless sleepless nights. "Funny," she said softly. "Security walks a lot faster when the order comes from me." And for the first time since Joanna Bryant entered Crosswell Group years ago, Damien Cross looked genuinely powerless. The first crack appeared 3 days later. Not publicly, privately. That was how powerful men unraveled. Quietly at first. Joanna sat inside the executive conference room, reviewing restructuring proposals while snow drifted beyond the windows of downtown Chicago. The room no longer intimidated her. Now it felt like a battlefield. She finally understood. Rebecca Sloan sat across from her highlighting sections inside legal folders. 3 executives already requested immunity consultations, Rebecca said calmly. Joanna looked up. That fast. Rebecca almost smirked. Corporate loyalty disappears the moment prison becomes possible. Joanna leaned back slowly in her chair. 3 weeks earlier, she would have found all of this overwhelming. Now, she found it predictable. Fear changed people quickly, especially men who built identities around control. Her phone buzzed softly beside the folder. Spencer. Again. 17 missed calls in 2 days. Joanna stared at the screen without emotion before silencing it. Rebecca noticed immediately. "He still thinks this is salvageable." Joanna gave a faint, humorless laugh. "No, I think he still believes he can talk his way back into power. Rebecca nodded once. That sounds more accurate. The truth was, Spencer had changed dramatically since Joanna took control of Crosswell. The confidence was gone now. The arrogance, too. In its place lived panic. Because suddenly, Spencer understood something terrifying. Joanna no longer needed him emotionally, financially, or socially. And men like Spencer only valued independence when it belonged to them. A sharp knock interrupted the silence. Margaret entered, holding another financial report. Damien's legal team is collapsing, she announced calmly. Rebecca looked mildly impressed. That was quick. Margaret removed her gloves carefully. One attorney resigned this morning. She glanced toward Joanna. Apparently, fraud becomes less glamorous once evidence exists. Joanna exhaled slowly, part of her expected satisfaction from all this. Victory? Triumph? Instead, she mostly felt tired. Not weak, just aware. Aware of how many lives corporate greed destroyed quietly every year while wealthy people protected each other behind legal language. Margaret studied her carefully. You're thinking too emotionally again. Joanna frowned slightly. I'm thinking realistically. No, Margaret corrected calmly. You're still grieving the illusion that these people ever cared about loyalty. That landed harder than Joanna expected, because somewhere deep down, part of her still mourned the marriage she thought she had, not Spencer himself. The dream, the version of love she built entire sacrifices around. Before Joanna could answer, the conference room doors opened suddenly. Spencer walked inside, uninvited, disheveled, and visibly exhausted. Joanna almost didn't recognize him. His expensive suits no longer looked polished. His confidence no longer filled rooms. Stress had finally reached him. Rebecca immediately stood. This meeting is private. I just need 5 minutes, Spencer said quietly. Joanna didn't answer at first. She simply looked at him. Really looked at him. For years, Spencer seemed larger than life to her, charismatic, ambitious, socially magnetic. Now he just looked like a man terrified of consequences. Joanna nodded once toward Rebecca and Margaret. It's fine. Neither woman looked thrilled, but they left. The moment the doors closed, silence settled heavily between Joanna and Spencer. He stared at her across the long conference table. You look happy, he said quietly. Joanna almost laughed. Happy? Was that really what he saw? I look rested, she corrected. The answer visibly affected him, because Spencer suddenly realized something devastating. Joanna had not collapsed without him. She recovered. Stronger. Spencer stepped closer slowly. I made mistakes. Joanna folded her hands calmly. That's an interesting word for betrayal. His jaw tightened. I know you're angry. No, Joanna said softly. Angry was 6 months ago. The honesty in her voice unsettled him immediately, because rage still implied emotional attachment. Calmness didn't. Spencer sat down heavily across from her. They're investigating everything now. Yes. Vanessa's cooperating. Joanna wasn't surprised. Self-preservation always exposed fake loyalty eventually. Spencer rubbed both hands over his face. I never thought things would go this far. Joanna stared at him silently for several seconds, then asked the question she should have asked years ago. What exactly did you think would happen? Spencer looked away immediately. And there it was again. The avoidance, the inability to confront himself honestly. You loved feeling superior to me, Joanna said quietly. His head snapped back up. That's not true. Yes, it is. Her voice stayed calm, precise, unshaking. You loved being admired, needed, supported. Joanna tilted her head slightly. But the moment I stopped making your life easier, you treated me like an inconvenience. Spencer swallowed hard. That's not fair. Joanna almost smiled, sadly. Men always called truth unfair once it stopped benefiting them. You know what I finally realized? She continued softly. You didn't want a partner. Spencer's face tightened. You wanted emotional staff. The sentence cut deep. She saw it happen instantly. Because it was true. Joanna spent years functioning like unpaid emotional infrastructure, managing his moods, protecting his ego, supporting his ambitions, minimizing herself so he could feel larger. And Spencer never once questioned whether that dynamic was love. You think I never loved you? He whispered. Joanna's chest tightened painfully, because once upon a time, she would have answered differently. I think you loved access to me, she replied honestly. That's not the same thing. Silence filled the room. Heavy, devastating. Spencer's eyes grew red suddenly, and for the first time since Joanna met him, he looked genuinely afraid. Not of losing money, not of public scandal, of losing her permanently. I don't know who I am without you, he admitted quietly. The confession hit Joanna unexpectedly hard, because she believed him, and somehow that made everything even sadder. She remembered the man she married, charming, ambitious, affectionate, full of dreams. But somewhere along the way, Spencer became addicted to admiration instead of intimacy. And Joanna enabled it by sacrificing herself endlessly. That realization hurt both of them, but only one person chose betrayal. Joanna reached calmly into her leather portfolio. Spencer frowned slightly. What's that? She slid several papers across the table. His expression changed immediately when he saw the header. Divorce petition. Spencer looked stunned. You already filed 3 weeks ago. The color drained from his face. You planned this without telling me. Joanna almost laughed at the hypocrisy. You planned my public humiliation without telling me. He flinched visibly. Good. Finally. Finally, he felt even a fraction of what she carried for months. Spencer stared at the documents like they physically hurt him. You're really leaving me? Joanna looked directly at him. No, she said softly. I'm leaving the version of myself that believed surviving mistreatment was the same thing as love. Tears filled Spencer's eyes instantly, but Joanna no longer rushed to comfort him. That chapter of her life was over. Outside the conference room windows, Chicago glittered beneath falling snow, while Crosswell Group slowly collapsed floor by floor beneath investigations and panic. And somewhere deep inside herself, Joanna finally understood something freeing. Men panic the moment women stop begging to be chosen. The final board meeting began at 8 a.m. sharp on a Monday morning. Snowstorm warnings covered Chicago, but nobody at Crosswell Group cared about weather anymore. They cared about survival. Executives filled the massive boardroom in tense silence, while assistants rushed between chairs distributing financial packets. Some people avoided eye contact completely. Others whispered nervously behind coffee cups. Fear had changed the atmosphere of the company. Gone were the arrogant conversations. Gone were the careless laughs. Now everyone spoke carefully, because everyone understood something dangerous was happening. Joanna stood alone near the windows overlooking downtown Chicago while the city disappeared beneath heavy gray snow clouds. 6 months earlier, she would have felt intimidated walking into a room like this. Today, the room adjusted itself around her. Margaret Hale entered first, then Rebecca Sloan, then legal counsel, and finally, Damian Cross. 2 months ago, Damian moved through Crosswell like a king. Now he looked exhausted. The confidence remained on the surface, but panic had started leaking through the cracks. Sleepless eyes, tightened jaw, the subtle desperation of a man losing authority publicly. Vanessa entered behind him, wearing a cream-colored suit and carefully controlled expression. But Joanna noticed the distance immediately. Vanessa no longer walked past Damian. Interesting. Everyone was abandoning the sinking ship now. Spencer arrived last. He looked directly at Joanna the moment he entered. She felt the weight of his stare immediately. Regret still lived there. Grief, too. But Joanna no longer felt emotionally pulled toward him. That was the strangest part of healing. One day, the person who once controlled your emotions completely simply stopped having access to them. Rebecca Sloan stood calmly at the front of the room. "We'll begin." The boardroom fell silent instantly. Rebecca activated the presentation screens. Financial records appeared across the walls. Expense trails, shell corporations, unauthorized transfers. The evidence looked even uglier, displayed publicly. Rebecca spoke without emotion. Over the last 4 fiscal years, Crosswell Group engaged in systematic financial concealment through layered vendor structures and falsified reporting. Damien immediately interrupted. "These accusations are exaggerated." Rebecca didn't even glance toward him. "Several transactions were authorized directly through executive approval channels connected to your office." More documents appeared. Joanna watched board members shifting uncomfortably now. Some looked furious, others terrified, because scandals only felt entertaining until your own signature appeared near them. Rebecca continued. "In addition to financial misconduct, evidence also suggests retaliatory termination practices targeting employees who questioned reporting inconsistencies." A list of former employees appeared on screen, mostly women, including Joanna. The room became visibly uncomfortable. Good. It should. For years, powerful people treated women's professional destruction like collateral damage. Now it was evidence. Damien leaned forward sharply. "This company survived because difficult decisions were made." Joanna finally spoke. "No," she said calmly. "This company survived because loyal people kept cleaning up your damage." Silence. The sentence landed hard, because everyone knew it was true. Executives like Damien built reputations using invisible labor from exhausted employees underneath them, especially women. Especially women too kind to demand credit. Rebecca resumed presenting evidence while legal counsel reviewed possible criminal exposure. Then came Spencer's section. Joanna saw him tense immediately. Projected across the screen, consulting authorizations, secondary approvals, offshore vendor signatures. Spencer looked physically sick. One board member turned toward him in disbelief. "You signed these?" Spencer swallowed hard. Damien said the transfers were temporary restructuring measures. Damien scoffed immediately. "Oh, now you're innocent." The panic between them escalated quickly after that. Men always turned on each other once consequences arrived. "You approved everything," Spencer snapped, "and you benefited from it. You told me it was legal. You should have verified that before signing documents blindly." Joanna watched both men carefully. Months ago, this scene would have emotionally destroyed her. Now, she simply saw two frightened people scrambling to avoid accountability. Vanessa finally stood abruptly. "I want it officially stated that I cooperated fully once the investigation began." There it was. Self-preservation. Predictable. Damien stared at her in open disbelief. "You're testifying against me?" Vanessa's face hardened. "You were going to let all of us burn for your mistakes." Joanna almost pitied Damien for 1 second. Almost. Because betrayal always shocked people who believed themselves entitled to loyalty. The irony was almost poetic. Rebecca eventually closed the final folder. "Based on current evidence, we recommend immediate removal of Damien Cross from executive authority pending federal review." A vote followed. Fast. Brutal. Final. Hands slowly raised around the table, one after another, against Damien. When the final count finished, silence filled the room. Damien Cross had officially lost the company he built. He stared around the boardroom like he genuinely couldn't understand how this happened. But Joanna understood perfectly. Arrogance blinded people to consequences, especially men used to surviving through intimidation. Damien finally looked directly at Joanna. "You think this makes you powerful?" The old Joanna might have reacted emotionally. might have defended herself, explained herself. This Joanna simply held his gaze calmly. "No," she answered softly. "I think surviving people like you made me dangerous." The room fell silent again, because everyone felt the truth inside that sentence. Damien grabbed his coat violently before storming toward the exit. But near the doorway, he stopped suddenly, then turned back toward Joanna one last time. "You'll become exactly like me eventually." The accusation hung heavily in the room. Joanna thought about it carefully before answering. "No," she said quietly, "because I know what it feels like to be powerless in rooms like this." Damien said nothing after that. He simply walked out, and for the first time since founding Crosswell Group, he left the boardroom without control. The silence afterward felt strange, not victorious exactly, heavy. Board members slowly gathered documents while attorneys discussed restructuring procedures. Around the room, people began breathing normally again, but Joanna remained near the windows, watching snow fall across Chicago. Margaret approached quietly beside her. "You won," she said softly. Joanna stared out at the city. Did she? Crosswell was hers now. Damien was gone. Spencer had destroyed himself. Everything she once imagined revenge would accomplish had happened. So why did she still feel hollow? Margaret studied her carefully. "What's wrong?" Joanna hesitated, then answered honestly. "I thought this would feel better." Margaret nodded slowly. "Because revenge is satisfying," she said calmly. "But healing is something else entirely." The words settled deep inside Joanna's chest. For years, she thought justice alone would repair what betrayal destroyed. But standing there in the boardroom, she realized something important. Winning against people who hurt you does not automatically rebuild the parts of yourself you abandoned, trying to survive them. Joanna looked back toward the empty chair Damien once occupied, then toward Spencer, sitting alone at the far end of the room, looking completely broken. And finally, she understood. This story was never truly about destroying powerful men. It was about learning not to destroy herself, trying to love them. 3 months after the boardroom reckoning, Joanna Bryant stood barefoot in her new kitchen, watching sunrise spill across Lake Michigan. The house was smaller than the one she once shared with Spencer. Smaller kitchen, smaller closets, smaller walls. But somehow, it felt bigger, because peace takes up space. Soft, golden light filled the quiet home, while coffee brewed behind her. Outside, snow melted slowly along the lakeshore as Chicago woke beneath pale winter skies. For the first time in years, Joanna's mornings no longer began with anxiety. No rushing, no emotional caretaking, no fear of disappointing someone before breakfast. Just silence. Healthy silence. And Joanna was still learning how to trust it. Her therapist once told her, "Women leaving emotionally manipulative relationships often mistake calmness for emptiness at first." That sentence haunted Joanna for weeks, because she realized how addicted she became to emotional survival. Chaos had once felt normal. Stress had once felt like love. Exhaustion had once felt like commitment. Now she was learning something entirely new: peace. Not every day was easy. Healing never happened in straight lines. Some nights, Joanna still woke suddenly at 3 a.m. convinced she forgot an urgent email. Some mornings, she still instinctively reached for her phone, expecting criticism from Damien or emotional tension from Spencer. Trauma lived inside the body long after people escaped it. But slowly, she was becoming someone softer with herself. Crosswell Group had changed dramatically under her leadership. Several executives resigned voluntarily before investigations reached them. New employee protections were implemented. Transparent reporting replaced intimidation culture. And most importantly, women inside the company finally stopped apologizing for existing in professional spaces. That mattered deeply to Joanna. One afternoon, she walked through the executive floor and noticed something simple. Employees laughed now. Not performative laughter, real laughter. The kind people only make when fear no longer controls the room. Ethan Cole became director of operations. Several previously terminated women were rehired. Margaret continued mentoring Joanna quietly from the background while refusing public credit. "You don't need me forever," Margaret told her one evening. Joanna smiled softly. "That sounds suspiciously emotional for you." Margaret rolled her eyes. "Don't ruin my reputation." But beneath the sarcasm lived pride. Real pride. Because Margaret understood something few people ever admitted, openly watching another woman rediscover her worth after years of being diminished was powerful. Not because it created revenge, because it created freedom. Later that week, Joanna visited a women's leadership conference hosted downtown. Months ago, she would have hidden near the back of the room, hoping nobody noticed her. Now women approached her constantly. "You inspired me to leave my toxic job. I started negotiating my salary after hearing your story. You made me realize exhaustion isn't loyalty." Each conversation affected Joanna more than she expected, because for years, she believed survival was personal, private. But emotional manipulation was everywhere. Corporate exploitation was everywhere. Women shrinking themselves to protect fragile men was everywhere. And once you finally saw it, you couldn't unsee it. That night, Spencer called again. The divorce was nearly finalized now. Joanna stared at the phone for a long moment before finally answering. "Hello, silence." Then his voice, quiet, tired. "I wasn't sure you'd pick up." Joanna walked slowly toward the living room windows overlooking the dark lake. "What do you need at Spencer?" A long pause followed, then finally, "I saw the interview." Earlier that morning, Joanna appeared briefly on a business segment discussing ethical restructuring at Crosswell. "You sounded—" Spencer hesitated. "Happy." Joanna closed her eyes briefly. "Not happy exactly, but lighter. I'm getting there." The honesty seemed to hurt him. "I barely recognize you anymore." Joanna leaned softly against the window. "That's because I spent years becoming whoever made you comfortable." Silence again. Then Spencer laughed bitterly under his breath. "You know the worst part?" Joanna said nothing. "I really thought you'd come back." The confession felt painfully human, because part of Joanna once believed that too. Women conditioned to overgive often returned repeatedly to people who hurt them. Not because they lacked intelligence, because they confused endurance with love. But something inside Joanna finally changed. She no longer romanticized suffering. "I would have," she admitted quietly. "The old version of me would have." Spencer's breathing caught softly through the phone. That answer wounded him more than anger ever could. "Do you hate me?" he asked. Joanna thought carefully before answering. Once she did. For months, rage kept her moving, protected her, strengthened her. But hatred was heavy, and Joanna was tired of carrying things that only poisoned her. "No," she said honestly. "I think you hated yourself long before you ever hurt me." Silence. Then quiet, crying. Spencer tried hiding it, but Joanna heard it anyway. And strangely, she didn't feel victorious, just sad. Sad for the years both of them lost inside a relationship built more on dependency than truth. "You were the best thing that ever happened to me," Spencer whispered. Joanna looked out across the frozen lake. "No," she replied softly. "I was the safest." The distinction mattered because Spencer loved comfort, validation, emotional access. But actual love, real love, real love required accountability, mutual care, respect. And Spencer only learned that after losing it. When the call finally ended, Joanna stood quietly in the dark living room for several minutes. Not crying, not shaking, just breathing, peacefully. The next morning, she visited Crosswell's Employee Wellness Center during renovations. Construction workers moved equipment across the lobby, while new office plans covered the walls. Joanna noticed one large, empty space near the entrance. "What's going there?" Ethan asked. Joanna smiled faintly. "A leadership resource center for young women entering corporate environments." Ethan grinned. Damien would hate that. Exactly. A few days later, movers removed Damien Cross's old executive desk from storage, the same black marble desk once used to humiliate employees, to intimidate people, to make women feel disposable. Joanna rested one hand lightly against the surface, then turned toward the movers. "Donate it." They looked confused. "Donate it?" Joanna nodded. "To the Women's Leadership Center, not because the desk mattered, because symbols did. Years ago, that desk represented power she believed belonged only to people like Damien. Now it represented something else entirely: survival. Rebirth. Proof that broken women could rebuild themselves without becoming cruel. That evening, Joanna stood outside her lakefront home, wrapped in a wool coat while snow drifted softly through the air. For the first time in years, her life belonged completely to her. No manipulation, no emotional performance, no shrinking, just freedom, and standing there beneath the Chicago winter sky. Joanna finally understood something: healing revenge may start the journey. But self-respect is what truly saves you. The divorce became official on a snowy Thursday morning in February. No dramatic courtroom scene, no screaming, no final emotional collapse, just signatures. Ink drying quietly across legal paper while two people officially ended the life they once promised each other forever. Joanna sat across from Spencer inside a private mediation office downtown. Large windows overlooked frozen Chicago streets, while soft classical music played somewhere faintly in the background. It felt strangely ordinary. That was the shocking thing about endings. Even devastating ones rarely looked cinematic in real life. Spencer looked older now, not physically, emotionally. The confidence that once filled every room around him had dissolved into something quieter, more honest. For the first time since Joanna met him, he looked like a man forced to sit alone with himself. The attorney slid the final documents forward. "That completes everything." Joanna signed first. Steady hand. No hesitation. Spencer stared at the papers several seconds longer before finally signing too. And just like that, it was over. 10 years together, reduced to legal closure in under 30 minutes. The attorney left shortly afterward, giving them privacy neither of them knew what to do with. Spencer stared down at his folded hands. "I still can't believe this happened." Joanna looked at him carefully. The old version of her would have rushed to comfort him, would have softened herself to protect his feelings. Not anymore. "It happened slowly," she said quietly. "We just ignored it until it became impossible to survive." Spencer swallowed hard. "You really don't love me anymore." The question hurt more than she expected. Not because she wanted him back, because she remembered the woman who once loved him with terrifying sincerity. That woman would have destroyed herself trying to save this marriage. Joanna felt grief for her sometimes, but not regret. "I think I'll always care about what happened to us," she admitted softly. "But love can't survive where respect disappears." Spencer closed his eyes briefly. Tears gathered there almost instantly. "I ruined everything." Joanna didn't answer right away, because healing had taught her something important. People who destroy relationships rarely do it in one dramatic moment. They do it gradually, through entitlement, neglect, emotional selfishness, tiny betrayals repeated over time. "You ruined yourself first," she said finally. The truth settled heavily between them. Spencer let out a shaky breath. "I would do anything to fix this." Joanna believed him. That was the tragedy. He finally understood her value only after losing access to it. But some lessons arrived too late to rebuild what they destroyed. Outside snow drifted softly against the windows while silence filled the room one last time. Then Joanna stood. Spencer looked up quickly. "That's it," Joanna slipped on her gloves slowly. "Yes." A flicker of panic crossed his face, like he still expected one final emotional scene, one final rescue, one final chance. But Joanna no longer existed to emotionally save him from himself. At the doorway, she paused briefly, then looked back. "I genuinely hope you heal someday, Spencer." The kindness in her voice almost broke him completely, because for the first time, it came without attachment, without self-sacrifice, without surrender, and somehow that hurt him more than hatred ever could. Joanna left the building alone, but she no longer feared being alone. That was the difference. Months later, Crosswell Group looked nothing like the company Damian Cross once controlled. The atmosphere changed completely transparent. Leadership, protected reporting systems, mentorship programs for young female employees, wellness policies, accountability structures. People no longer whispered fearfully in hallways. They contributed openly, questioned openly, laughed openly. And every time Joanna walked through the executive floor, she remembered the woman she used to be there. The exhausted assistant carrying everyone else's responsibilities while slowly disappearing herself. Sometimes healing looked like becoming unrecognizable to your former pain. One spring afternoon, Joanna attended the opening ceremony for the new Women's Leadership Initiative Center, funded by Crosswell's restructuring program. Young women filled the space, interns, analysts, assistants, recent graduates. Women who reminded Joanna painfully of herself years earlier, nervous, hardworking, overeager to prove their worth. The donated marble desk sat near the entrance beneath soft lighting. Damian Cross's old desk. A small bronze plaque rested beside it. It read, "Never confuse kindness with weakness." Margaret stood quietly beside Joanna during the ceremony. "You know," Margaret said dryly, "most people buy yachts after corporate victories." Joanna laughed softly. "I thought about it." "No, you didn't." "Okay, I didn't." Margaret smirked faintly before studying the room full of young women. "You built something I better." Joanna looked around slowly. Maybe she had. Not because she defeated Damian, not because Spencer regretted losing her, but because she stopped abandoning herself for people who only valued her sacrifice. That was the real victory. Later that evening, Joanna walked alone along Lake Michigan while the Chicago skyline glowed gold behind her. Spring winds moved gently through her hair while city lights reflected across dark water. Her phone buzzed once, a message from an unknown number. Curious, Joanna opened it. It was a photo. Someone had taken a picture of the Women's Leadership Center earlier that day. Underneath it was a single sentence, "You changed more lives than you realize." No signature. But Joanna somehow knew it was Margaret. She smiled softly to herself. For years, Joanna thought strength looked loud, aggressive, untouchable. Now she understood something entirely different. Real strength looked like boundaries, peace, self-respect, emotional honesty, walking away from people who only loved your usefulness. And maybe most importantly, real strength meant no longer begging to be chosen by people incapable of valuing you properly. Joanna stopped walking near the shoreline and looked out across the water. The city behind her glittered with endless noise and ambition. But inside herself, everything finally felt quiet. Not empty, peaceful. And as snow from the last dying pieces of winter melted into the dark Chicago lake, Joanna Bryant smiled gently beneath the night sky, not because revenge made her happy, but because she finally belonged to herself again. Some of the deepest heartbreaks in life do not come from strangers. They come from the people we once trusted enough to build our future around. Joanna's story reminds us that betrayal rarely begins with one dramatic moment. It begins quietly, with disrespect, excused too many times, sacrifices made without balance, and a person slowly shrinking themselves just to keep a relationship alive. One of the hardest lessons adulthood teaches is this: being needed is not the same as being loved. For years, Joanna confused exhaustion with loyalty. She believed that if she gave enough, supported enough, forgave enough, eventually she would be valued the same way she valued others. But relationships built on one person constantly sacrificing themselves will eventually become emotionally unequal. And the saddest part is that many kind people do not realize they are disappearing until someone finally breaks them. But this story is not really about revenge. It is about awakening. Because the moment Joanna stopped begging for love, approval, and respect from people who benefited from her weakness, she finally began rebuilding her own life. She discovered that self-worth changes everything. Boundaries change everything. And sometimes, losing the people you thought you needed is exactly what saves you. Not everyone who hurts you will regret it immediately. Some people only recognize your value after losing access to you completely. But healing is not about making them suffer. Healing is about no longer abandoning yourself to keep others comfortable. If Joanna's journey touched you emotionally, take a moment and ask yourself, have you ever stayed too long in a place where you were only appreciated for what you provided, not for who you were? And if you were Joanna, would you have forgiven Spencer? Share your thoughts and feelings in the comments. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. And if you enjoy emotional drama stories about betrayal, healing self-worth, and powerful comebacks, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next story.